All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. So before we get into our content for the day, a couple of logistics stuff. Okay, so next week, I'm going to be out of town at a conference. This is technically going to be my last lecture. On Monday, we'll have a guest lecture. There's a colleague of mine, he actually taught the class last year, so he's pretty familiar. He'll do a little bit of last minute coverage on future of EVs, and then a little bit of review for the final. There will be a quiz next week. Since we only have one lecture, that quiz is just going to cover material from today. On Wednesday, we always do kind of a final class doing an EV showcase. So I've asked a bunch of folks to bring in their electric vehicles. This is going to be in West Village near our research center. And last lecture is totally optional. You get to chat with folks about their electric vehicles, kind of see interesting features of EVs, and have a chance to be up close and personal if you haven't before. That lecture is optional, but I will give extra credit for anyone who shows up, so that'll be worth one quiz just for attending. Okay, any questions about next week? No, pretty straightforward. Okay, and then following our last week, we will have our final exam. I think most of you guys should have this info already, but for those who don't, the final exam will be here in this room, but not at noon. Our schedule is 3:30. So we'll do 2 hours, 3:30 to 5:30. The format of the exam is going to cover the entire course, but we're going to do a little bit more emphasis on the last half of class, so things after the midterm. Okay? Any questions about the final? All right. And then the last thing, course evaluations are up. So please evaluate the course, not just for me, but to help the course develop for future students. If you have suggestions, things that you want to see, things that you liked or didn't like, please let us know. And I'll make an announcement with all of these logistics and administrative stuff as well. Okay, so on with kind of the last lecture of the course, or last kind of full lecture, I should say. So today, we've been covering a bunch of different policies. Right, we started with the California policies, then federal, and then international. And today we're going to be talking about a lot of the market instruments that we've been, touching on throughout the class, especially in some of the policy portions. Much of the policy discussion is focused on the regulatory instruments, right? But of course we have market-based instruments as well, most of which come in the form of incentives or subsidies of different kinds. And so that's what we'll be focused on today. And maybe most relevant for you guys in the future, if you are going to be buying an electric vehicle, this stuff is probably useful to know about. This is all money that might, come back to your pocket. So, what incentives do you actually get for buying an electric vehicle, right? So we know that you get money from the government for buying an EV. How does that actually work? Are these incentives actually effective in encouraging people to adopt an electric vehicle? And so We're going to look at the structure of the incentives, and then we're going to talk about some of the studies that have tried to estimate like the effects of the incentives, and that plays a role in how you can get the money to make a bigger difference in a design of some kind of subsidy policy. In terms of types of incentives, we'll talk about probably the obvious one, monetary and financial purchase incentives, but we'll also touch on some recurring incentives. And the idea is, why do we even offer these incentives in the first place? Right? These are meant to offset deficiencies of innovation that might have like early market issues, not a whole product. And so really the ideal incentive policy is going to encourage people to change some kind of decision making, right? So you would adopt this technology when you might not have otherwise. This can improve the relative advantage of a technology, and that's particularly important if we as a society feel that a particular technology is worth kind of pushing through, right? And so we have resources to support that. And the important thing about incentives in this kind of philosophy or this kind of framework is that originally EVs are going to be a lot more expensive, worse range, slower charging speeds, all of these things, right? But as the market improves, as the technology improves, a lot of these things are going to get better, and the idea is eventually incentives can kind of phase out. There's a question of when the appropriate time is to take away incentives, and we'll touch on that later on today as well. So to start off with the big ones, monetary incentives, particularly for buying a vehicle. So there's a bunch of different ways that this can be structured. The big federal one that had been in place prior to the current administration operated as an income tax credit, and we're going to talk about this more in just a moment. We can also have rebates, and we'll learn how that works. We have a different form. I'm kind of separating out this cash on the hood rebates, and the biggest reason is timing, and that actually turns out to be a pretty important factor as well, as we'll get to. And then another sort of on the hood type of incentive is like a sales tax exemption. We actually did talk about something similar, right, in Norway, where you'd be exempt from getting assessed the tax, the value-added tax, the sales tax. And there are some places in the US that have similar types of programs, such as Washington State. Okay, and so we're going to go through all these in a lot more detail. So starting with the federal one. So taxes are collected by the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, and so anything affecting taxes actually operates through their sort of their rule system. And so there is a particular section, Code Section 30D, that pertains to the purchase of an electric vehicle, right? And so this is among, a giant list of things. When you file taxes, there are things that you can get credit for, right? If you own a house, if you have kids, and this is one item in that whole code section that just gets, tacked in. And basically, when you file your taxes, you can say, oh, I had bought an electric vehicle, and that lets you receive certain tax credits. Okay. So this started way back in 2008, and went through 2021 before it was modified in the Inflation Reduction Act. And we'll get to that in the sort of more modern instantiation in a second. But essentially, you buy an electric vehicle, you're eligible to get a tax credit up to $7,500. The credit calculation, it's basically you're guaranteed $2,500, and then you get an additional $417 for the first 5 kilowatt hour battery, and then you get $417 for every kilowatt hour thereafter up to 7,500. Yeah, actually, I guess I cut off this parentheses on the last bullet. So it says full credit amount as long as vehicle has, I believe it's like 16 kilowatt hours, something like that. And actually, it was specifically designed, or the Chevy Volt, the plug-in hybrid, had a battery size that was specifically designed just to meet the threshold so that you could get exactly $7,500. Okay, so one nuance of this is it's a tax credit. And so for those who aren't familiar, this isn't like, oh, I go to the dealership, I buy a car, and then they just hand me 75, or someone just hands me 7,500. How this works is you buy the car, and now you are eligible for this. When you file your taxes in April, or whenever you decide to file your taxes, you can put this as an item. And if you have been paying taxes or if you owe taxes, you get a reduction in $7,500 of taxes, right? So you have a job, you pay, let's say, $10,000 in taxes. If you're doing, a regular deduction from your paycheck, you would have already paid that. You file your taxes, the IRS says, oh, you paid the $10,000 that you owe, but you get this tax credit for $7,500, so we're gonna cut you a check for $7,500. So there's kind of two important things with that, right? Is one, if you don't pay taxes, if you don't have $7,500 of tax liability, you actually don't get anything, or you would only get up to however much your tax liability is if it's less than $7,500. Secondly is you gotta wait, right? You buy the car, then you file your taxes, then you wait for IRS to send you a check. So there can be kind of a bigger time gap between you buying the car and getting that tax credit. At the end of the day, still a pretty good deal, right? You buy a car, you get $7,500 back, essentially. So to give a rough estimate of $7,500 tax liability, I think if you're single, that's something like $60,000 to $70,000. It might be a little bit less. And then if you're married, 7,500 is like 95,000. So just to give a sense of like what income you would need in order to qualify for the full amount of tax credit. Any questions about that? The other feature of this particular incentive was that it followed a phase-out schedule. So basically, it depends on the car that you buy. Okay, so if you buy a Tesla, and Tesla has already sold 200,000 cumulative EVs, then you wouldn't get anything. So once a automaker sells their 200,000th EV, it starts to phase out. After the first quarter, the amount of incentive reduces to 50%. And then after another quarter, it reduces, it decreases to 25%. And then the credit ends. So you can see what the schedule kind of looks like out here. Yeah. Oh, actually, I should say 2 quarters, not 1 quarter. So let's say 200,000th vehicle produced by manufacturer in February of 2010 phases out after 2 quarters, 50%, starting in July of the calendar quarter. And then January of next year goes down to 25%, and then July of the following year, the credit would fully end. Okay. And back when we had this particular structure, actually, do we have, yeah. So we have only 2 manufacturers actually hit the limit back when the incentive was structured in this way. And so that was Tesla, which hit 200,000 vehicles sold in 2018, and then you can see how the phase out happened over the next like 2 years, and then Chevrolet also hit 200,000 in the quarter following, and they phased out as well. Other automakers, I mean, everyone's selling a lot more these days, but back a decade ago, the automakers were selling a lot less, and around this time period, there were a couple of other manufacturers that were close to hitting the 200,000 target, and thereby having the incentives starting to phase out, but it had not happened yet. Okay. So a little bit of complicated structure, and actually, the reasoning behind this had originally been to try and penalize foreign automakers, because this kind of incentive design had originally been applied to hybrids, and they thought that like Toyota and Honda would be the first ones to hit it, but with this particular structure, Tesla was, I guess, and continues to be one of the dominant electric vehicle automakers, and so it was actually a domestic automaker who ended up hitting the target first. Okay, so the structure of that incentive existed from 2008 when it was first put in place all the way to 2021 or 2022. And then the Inflation Reduction Act was passed during the Biden administration. This chart is kind of a high-level overview of all of the types of funding for clean energy that the Inflation Reduction Act provided. And so you can kind of get a sense of like clean electricity, $51 billion, clean manufacturing tax credits, $30 billion. Okay, and so as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, they actually updated the rules to 30D, Section 30D, as I was just mentioning, and actually a couple of other tax credit sections as well, as incentives for people who are, buying things related to clean technologies, including electric vehicles. And so one of the things that they did was to get rid of that 200,000 cap, which means that Chevrolet and Tesla both started qualifying for incentives again. And so if you bought a Tesla prior to 2022, after 2018, you would have gotten a reduced amount of tax credit or no tax credit at all. But then if you bought a Tesla in 2022 after IRA was finalized, then you could actually get some tax credit again. And same with Chevrolet. However, they did add some more complicated rules. Okay, so one of the things that the Inflation Reduction Act tried to do was also to onshore manufacturing, and so not just for electric vehicles. You can, if you actually go into some of the guts and details of the bill. There's a lot happening in these like pots of money that are meant to basically try and get things to be built in the US, right? And so you're kind of coupling domestic policy, domestic promotion policy with, climate efforts. And so the idea is like strengthen the economy, improve outlook for jobs in the sector in the US, right? there's a balance in policy. You might do things differently if you care just about climate, but they're trying to balance with domestic production of goods and services as well. And so as a result of that, the Section 30D incentives were modified. Okay. Okay, so they added in income eligibility limits. This is something that probably came a little bit from California influence. We'll talk about that as well with the rebate program, how that has changed over time. One of the things is adding income limits. Basically, I don't want to give a $7,500 tax credit to some super rich person who's buying an electric vehicle and can totally afford it, right? That adds into the efficacy of the incentive, because people who are really rich, maybe they would have bought the electric vehicle anyways because they can afford it, right? You want to make sure that the incentive is really going to, or the most effective incentive is something that changes someone's mind, right? That they would have bought a gas car, and now because there's an incentive, they buy the EV. If you were buying the EV anyways, you're kind of like a freeloader. You're getting the tax credit, even though you technically didn't really need it. So that's kind of the reasoning behind the income limits. What else? So is the vehicle manufactured in North America? So if it's not, if it's a foreign produced car, you don't get the tax credit. This isn't so much of an issue as people think, right? So even if you're talking about a foreign automaker brand, like Toyota or Volkswagen, right? These are Asian and European automakers respectively. They have factories in the US. Most of the cars are not imported. Most cars are going to be domestically manufactured. And so this isn't quite as big of a deal as a lot of people think. Okay, now you could get different types of vehicles that cost different amounts of money. So that's kind of the next tier here. And so if it is, if it's a smaller vehicle, like a sedan, it has to be less than $55,000. If it's an SUV, truck, or van, it can be $80,000 or less, right? So this is kind of similar to the income argument. It's like, are we going to give a $7,500 tax break to someone buying a $100,000 car? No, it's going to be focused on, I guess, quote unquote, on affordable cars. So similar logic as the income one. All right, so you qualify for your income, you qualify for the car being built in the US, and you qualify for the car being under some kind of MSRP. The final one, which is the big one that was probably the most debated. Sorry, actually I have these little, car price limits and was income. The big one that's most debated is this bottom one in blue. And so that, again, is supporting domestic production. So there's two things that are required. The one on the left is that 60% of the battery parts have to be made or assembled in North America, and then 50% of critical minerals have to be sourced in raw materials or recycled from production in North America. Okay, and those actually ramp up over time. So think about our discussion on battery, all the way back to battery manufacturing, right? Where do those materials come from? Like the lithium, the cobalt, the graphite. We were talking about lithium from South America or Australia. We're talking about cobalt coming from Africa, graphite coming from China. All of the refining of the materials going through China and flowing through before coming to the US, right? And so actually very, very difficult for most manufacturers to comply with these things. And actually reduce the number of qualified vehicles quite a bit. So back when IRA was first passed, only applied to about 20 electric vehicles. Okay. So, lots of limitations. What happened in response to this is that actually a lot of automakers started to try onshoring production. So they started building battery refining and manufacturing plants in the US, and then they started making plans to start sourcing things like lithium and other metals, or rare earth critical minerals from the US itself as well. And so, yeah, if you think about it, the incentives, they're meant for the consumers, but actually the design of them spurred production of domestic batteries. Okay, any questions about the incentives? So certainly got a little bit more complicated following IRA, but really you can think of it as similar as before, but we add some barriers to make sure that rich people buying expensive cars don't qualify, and we try to promote domestic production. That's kind of the reasoning behind this policy. I will say that there was one big loophole in all of this. So all of these apply specifically to buying a car, but they did not make rules about how this applies to leases, right? So we've talked about leases before, right? So this is essentially, instead of buying the car outright, you're essentially borrowing it for like 2 or 3 years. And you pay similar to that at the end of the lease. You can choose to buy out the car or to send it back to the dealer. So, because all of these restrictions don't apply to leases, people can, instead of buying the electric vehicle, can simply choose to lease them instead. And so Treasury announced that leased vehicles don't have to be assembled in North America and don't have to follow the requirements for all the critical minerals and battery production. So following this, there was a huge sort of immediate increase in leases. Okay? So in terms of the timeline, this is getting a little bit into some of the nuance here, but it does add some interesting kind of flavor for people who are trying to do analysis and understanding, how structural changes in the incentives can lead to changes in the market. So we were kind of paying close attention to these details, right? So even after IRA passed, you could have the previous EV tax credit. And then what ends up happening is shortly after IRA becomes law, the new tax credit replaces the old tax credit. So that's starting in 2023. Following some time period to figure out implementation, they actually have a transfer of credit available. So what is that? This is actually a pretty interesting and important feature of the tax credit design. So remember what I was saying earlier, that if you buy the car, you get the tax credit, but you don't get it until you file your taxes the next year. The transfer credit lets you get it basically right away. You basically, when you buy the car, the dealer will pay you $7,500, and then the dealer gets to collect on your tax credit basically after you apply for your taxes. It is a little bit tricky, right? The dealer needs to be able to verify that you will have $7,500 of tax liability, right? Otherwise, they give you the money, and then so they're on the hook for it. And then if you don't get that money, then they may claw back some of the credit. But the main idea behind this, right, is the transfer of credit allows you to claim the credit right when you buy the car, and that is pretty valuable. Right, so why does it matter that, like, let's say I buy the car in August and then I get the credit in April? Well, so one, we know that money today is worth more than money now, or sorry, money in the future. So getting $7,500 today is actually worth more than money that I'm getting 6 months from now. But it can actually change the way that you may decide to, like, finance your car itself to be more affordable, right? So, if I take a $30,000 loan and then I get $7,500 later, maybe the terms of my loan would be quite different than if I just applied it right away and I did like a $22,000 loan. That changes the math. It could change decision making, and so both of these things can influence purchasing behavior to make it, more compelling to buy an EV. The ramp up of the 50% battery production or 60% battery production and 50% critical minerals goes all the way up to 100% banning of foreign critical minerals by 2025. And then it was slated to expire in 2032. So in addition to all the details that I talked about earlier, like, different things kind of kick in at different times based on the law. So where are we today? Well, it's actually all gone. So July 4th last year, Trump passed the One Big Beautiful Bill, which totally eliminated the 30D tax credits for purchasing electric vehicles. And I'll show this kind of slide that I did before, right? This was sales in the recent time period. And so last year, sales looked like this, and then you had the tax credit phase out, and basically a big plummet in sales happening right after that. And so future sales has since been a little bit depressed compared to previous years. And a lot of that is attributed to the tax credit going away. Any questions? So today, if you were to buy an electric vehicle, unfortunately, you would not receive any incentive from the federal government anymore. Whereas in the past, decade and a half, that had not been true. Yes.
Has there been any work by, like, the state of California to kind of push back against that, since California?
Yeah. So California is often trying to, hold up the mantle when the federal government drops the ball on some things. With subsidies, not really, at least not directly, and that has more to do with kind of the tightness of the California budget. We'll talk a little bit about where the money comes from for California's program. That's usually from GGRF, which is from the cap and trade program. And those funds are always, like, highly competitive with other, like, clean technology stuff. And so there has not been as much available, even though, people have tried to use that as a way to kind of replace this. And there's still talk about it, but nothing's happened yet. Any other questions? Okay. So as I mentioned, the mere fact that the consumer, or the design of the policy, even though it's targeted for consumers, was focused on domestic manufacturing, we can see kind of immediately after Inflation Reduction Act was passed that there was kind of this like big spike and increase in domestic manufacturing. And one thing about the One Big Beautiful Bill is that, you know, a lot of the incentives, both direct and indirect, to support domestic production, a lot of that was basically removed. And if it's, you know, this, I guess to some extent people think about this as like, you know, a Democratic versus Republican sort of policy position. Well, actually, they're really kind of shooting themselves in the foot here, because a lot of the domestic manufacturing actually went to red states. And so where were those battery manufacturing plants being pushed? Where were the new factories to produce electric vehicles being built? A lot of them are in like the Bible Belt area, so Georgia, Mississippi, a little north of that, Tennessee as well, and so a lot of the investments that were lost actually came out of red states. Okay, so that is on the federal tax credit. Touching on what I was just mentioning, at the state level, we also have incentives. And so kind of in a similar way, I'm going to back up and talk about the first program that California had for many, many years. And this is known as the Clean Vehicle Rebate Program, or CVRP. So this is on top of the federal tax credits, right? So you get that $7,500. And the first version of CVRP, you could qualify for up to $5,000. So way back in 2010, you know, if you bought like one of the first Nissan Leafs, you could have gotten $7,500 from the federal government and then another $5,000 right off the bat from California. So you get $12,500 for buying this new electric vehicle. Very shortly after, they reduced the amounts. So this is the one that this version is kind of the one that I'm most familiar with. So for many years, from like 2011 through about 2016, they offered essentially $1,500 for a plug-in hybrid and then $2,500 for a full battery electric vehicle. Okay. This is a different program. This is not a tax credit. This is just a straight up rebate. So you buy the car and then you basically mail in a form to the government, and then they cut a check for you that comes in the mail shortly thereafter. Okay, and so for many years, you know, you had this $1,500, $2,500 rebates, and then starting in 2016, they started changing some of the rules. You get less money. I should say that. So you get more incentive actually if you qualified under a low income program, and then you get that $1,500 and $2,500 respectively if you are income qualified, which means you're above the income threshold to get the expanded amount. And then they also have income caps, right? So I think this is kind of actually what influenced some of the federal policy decision making. It came kind of from California first, where if you're really rich, you essentially don't get to claim this rebate. And actually, it was still pretty high. I think, trying to remember what the income limits were. I don't know if I have them listed here. Yeah, well, I think it's something like $150,000, you know, household income. If you're above that, then you wouldn't qualify. If you're below that, you would still get it. So still, I would say maybe relatively high. So over the course of CVRP, how much money did they give out? How many rebates? Looks something like this. So far and away, so they did give some rebates to like fuel cell vehicles and other like zero emission like motorcycles and commercial vehicles and that sort of thing. But that in general, very low volumes, especially compared to plug-in hybrids and battery electric vehicles. I mainly think of this program as rebate programs for these vehicles. So almost 500,000 BEVs and 150,000 PHEVs, totaling to money that essentially the state of California shelled out to these buyers in excess of $1 billion, right? So $1.1 billion to battery electric vehicles and almost $250 million out to plug-in hybrids. So these programs do tend to be pretty expensive. And because of that, they actually did run into funding problems. So where does the CVRP funding come from? So a lot of their funding comes from the greenhouse gas emission reduction fund. So this comes from cap and trade. I'm not going to get into cap and trade for this class, but it is essentially a carbon market program that limits the total amount of carbon that the state of California can emit, or like industry operating in the state of California. They have this whole credit program that generates revenue, and those revenues go back into programs that are trying to clean the state, right? And so that could be like energy efficiency programs, solar programs, and electric vehicle programs. And so CVRP derives their money from that. But these programs are really popular. A lot of people buying electric vehicles, and so they would run out of money that they would be promising as rebates to people. And so if you were buying in certain years, the average wait time to get for the program to get their funding upped or renewed could take quite a long time, right? On the order of a couple months, right? So ordinarily, if the money were available, you would send in a rebate form. They would verify your income and make sure you're all qualified for all the rules and eligibility, and then they would send you the money. And that could happen, that ideally would happen, in a couple of weeks. But here you may be waiting a couple of months because of their funding issues. Okay, I do have a slide on this. So the income restrictions. So this kicked in 2016. So single filers, 250,000, 340,000, and then $500,000 for joint filers, right? To be eliminated from being eligible for the rebates, and then they ended up lowering that cap a little bit later on that year. And they also increased the rebate for low to moderate income consumers. So you get an additional $1,500 or $2,000 if you fall under an income threshold. Right, so again, the idea is you're really rich, you're buying an EV, you probably don't need our help. And if you're really poor, we're gonna give you extra help to buy an electric vehicle. So CVRP as a program has finished, and it's been replaced by mainly income qualified programs in California. So there's a couple of the different ones of these. So there's EFMP. This actually existed at the same time as CVRP, and so there was some overlap. But basically, if you are a low-income resident living in one of the air districts that has low air quality, then you can qualify for additional benefits. The Clean Cars for All and the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program, these are both California programs that basically kind of operate. I don't know if anyone's heard of the old Cash for Clunkers program, But this is basically, you bring in an old car of yours, an old car, it's more polluting. There's specific requirements on how old the car is and what type of vehicle. But they will take it off your hands, give you a big incentive if you buy an electric vehicle. So it's like a trade-in program essentially. So the Driving Clean Assistance Program expanded the Clean Cars for All and replaced CVAP. And so you can see kind of what those rules look like today. It is a little bit confusing. So income eligibility less than or equal to 300% of the federal poverty level, or less than or equal to 300% federal poverty level in a disadvantaged community. You can get, so 8 years old or newer hybrid vehicle, you could get $7,000 back. Or if it's 8 years old or newer plug-in hybrid vehicle, you get $9,500 to $11,500 back. 300% of the federal poverty limit is $40,000 for a single person, $90,000 for a family of 4. There are lots of complaints about the sort of complexity of this policy. It's hard to understand some of the eligibility. You have to apply, there's a bunch of different paperwork that you have to fill out. And so because of this, there's uncertainty on how much you actually get. There's uncertainty on when or if you'll get the money. And then there's even legal implications of getting it wrong. And so, yeah, I think one of the lessons I want to point out here is that, the structure of the incentive matters. It's not just about, you can get like $7,000 back or whatever. The design of how hard it is to get that money, the loops that you have to jump through and the paperwork that you have to file and the time it takes to get it all make a big difference in, how effective we think the incentives are. And so there's other countries where it's a lot simpler. You don't have to have application. There's no eligibility determination that make that make the incentive essentially a lot more effective. And so we've seen clear examples of that in Norway, for example, where the tax burden is just removed from purchases. You don't have to worry about all of this stuff. Okay, any question about the California programs? So if you guys were to go out and buy an electric vehicle, there are still programs, at least within the state of California, that you would probably qualify for and be able to get, money back on. Okay, some other ones that I wanted to touch on. So Washington State, they have a tax exemption for electric vehicles. And this one is pretty straightforward, right? There's no rating on this. There's no eligibility. There's no paperwork that needs to be filed. Basically, you buy an electric vehicle and you don't have to pay taxes on it. And it is, the sales tax on a purchase of an item applied at the time, so that means you get it right away. It is lower than the state incentives that we were just talking about, right? So $1,300 compared to $2,500 for $2,500 for buying a battery electric vehicle under CVRP. It is smaller, but being applied at point of sale actually makes it it can be kind of as effective, and so we'll show some evidence of that in a little bit. So there are different structures of incentives depending on where you are. California has a bunch of them, but it's not the only one. So Washington, right? So places where you can get, so in the green and in yellow, these are places that enforce like I should say the places in blue and yellow are places that enforce certain types of penalties for having an EV, and then places in green and yellow give credits. So by penalty, the main thing that I mean is the registration fees that we've talked about before. So you buy an electric vehicle, you actually pay higher registration fees, and those go towards like road funding. And then as far as incentives, the ones in yellow and green are ones offering incentives in some way to buy an electric vehicle. Okay. Any questions? All right. So let's talk about some non-monetary incentives. Okay, so these are things that may cause people to want to buy an electric vehicle or similar technology, but aren't based off of getting some kind of like financial return. So the big one, maybe the most obvious, right, is the HOV lane stickers. I'm sure all of you guys have seen these on cars before, especially in California, right? So the HOV lane sticker, just to clarify, allows you to drive in the carpool lane even if you are just a single occupant in the car. And actually, you can also get other benefits from this as well. If you're going through like a toll, you can qualify for carpool occupancy, which means you could actually save money going through certain tolls, or it could even be free, right? So, if I were living in Oakland and driving into SF every day, you could actually save a lot of money from having something like this. This program actually preceded electric vehicles. So you may have seen really old hybrids, like the old Priuses, have the yellow sticker. And that's because this program started in the 2000s primarily as an incentive for those electric vehicles, for those hybrid vehicles. And then when electric vehicles started coming out, they changed the program to add these to electric vehicles as well. I actually have this. Yeah, so toll discounts, as I was mentioning, you can get like a 50% reduction in toll fees in some areas. You can travel in express lanes for free many times. So other benefits. This program has also ended back in October of last year. And so if you have a sticker, you're actually not allowed to drive in the carpool lane anymore just by yourself. There's been some talk about trying to extend this program, although it may require something to happen at the federal level, so I'm not entirely sure that that's going to be likely to happen. This program was highly popular, I should say. There were a couple of studies that tried to estimate how valuable these stickers were. And so one of the things that they did, this was a study done way back in like 2013 for the original yellow carpool stickers. Some researchers looked at the used car market, and they looked at how much people were paying for cars that had stickers versus cars that didn't have stickers for the same model, right? And so not everyone would get the carpool stickers. And people were paying as much as like $15,000 more for cars that have the stickers. And that may seem a little outrageous, right? But I don't know if anyone's ever driven around or tried to commute in like San Francisco or even worse in like Los Angeles, right? That can actually be a huge time savings, being able to use the carpool lane every day if you're like commuting. And so some people are willing to pay, quite a lot of money for this. And in fact, there were some other studies earlier on where the plug-in Priuses that preceded the Prius Prime, these were kind of like the prototype models. They didn't have a lot of them. They would come with these green carpool stickers, and a lot of people who were buying those cars were just getting them for the stickers. They actually didn't even know that you could plug them in. So we were doing these interviews like a decade ago with a bunch of people who would be shocked that they were actually driving an electric vehicle. They'd just been driving it on gas the whole time, and then using and mainly having bought the car just for carpool lane access. So yeah, these things can be very valuable to a subset of people, especially those who travel in traffic a lot. Yeah, small other incentives. I wouldn't necessarily, ever claim that something like this may change the decision for a purchase, but these are like extra perks, right? And so parking incentives, you get a park at the front of the line. There are, EV spots, oftentimes. Although half the time I feel like people just ignore those and they just park their gas car in there anyways. Other benefits, these are often charging benefits offered by auto companies. So the way this works is an auto company may make a deal with like a charging service provider to provide free charging, and this is like a little bit of a sort of added benefit for buying the car. So, Ford, for example, they work with Electrify America, and they say, if when you buy a new car, you get like 250 kilowatt hours of free charging, which is actually not very much. There are a couple of other companies, BMW, Polestar, where you get 2 years of 30-minute charging sessions for free on Electrify America. So those are maybe a little bit more valuable. And so different manufacturers offer different sorts of benefits. I don't know, this slide might be outdated. I think I made this 2 years ago. At this point, there may be different structures to the benefits that you can get. But as a slice in time, this is an overview of the type of benefit you would get buying a particular car from a particular manufacturer for charging. Okay. Any questions about these? Okay. Before getting to thinking about the efficacy of incentives and kind of the work done in that front, there's one more category of incentives I wanted to talk about, which is not for the cars themselves, but actually for the infrastructure. So what monetary incentives have there been for infrastructure? So let me talk about these sort of larger programs first, kind of the big one being the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program. So back in 2021, Congress had passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. This was a program that basically gave $5 billion to establish a charging network for electric vehicles. So this isn't an incentive that would go directly into your consumer pockets in a direct way. Instead, this is going to charging companies, right? So think about Electrify America, Tesla, or it could be a more boutique local, business that wants to put a charger in a particular configuration at a particular place. So they formed this joint office of energy and transportation to help implement this. And then they had a bunch of rules basically to have minimum standards for chargers. So this is kind of what it would look like. You would have essentially, so the black dots are where chargers already existed at the time. And essentially what they wanted to fill out was for this orange network, you would have a charger every 50 miles. And so there are many gaps in this network, and this program essentially would have filled out these gaps. And it's designed specifically as a way to do these like long distance travel so that you will have confidence and support from the infrastructure that you can get from, California and drive across the country without really having to worry about charging. They had a bunch of requirements associated with this. And so this is like the charges have to be up and working 97% of the time. We've talked about some of the complications with reliability, and why this isn't necessarily the best metric. But nonetheless, at least they have some kind of standard here. Every location has to have at least 4 charging ports. They have to be at least 150 kilowatt in speed or in power, I should say. They have to be available 24/7. You can't close them at nighttime. You need to bring in some of your own money, and this actually is not quite right. It should be $5 billion. The other $2.5 billion is for a slightly different program, not NEVI. And you also have to maintain the chargers for 5 years. So they had a bunch of rules that you'd have to qualify for to be eligible. But in general, right, as an indirect benefit to people owning and driving EVs, you would have a better network that you could rely on the highway. Okay. So that's one of the biggest ones for public charging. And then I would say, there's a whole bunch of programs, like in the state of California, for example, that you can get rebates on buying your own personal charger at home. Most of those are offered through utilities. So if you live in SMUD, Sacramento, right, where you have SMUD, or if you live in the Bay Area or in Davis, right, where you're PG&E, you can install a charger if you have an electric vehicle, and you can claim, some amount of money back to help pay for that. So instead of going to all of the individual utility programs, instead, what I'll kind of point to is where that money comes from. So there's a different program known as the Low Carbon Fuel Standards, which is one of the regulatory policies that I mentioned in our state policy lecture. This is basically where the fuel has to get cleaner, right? And so this is why gasoline in California, for example, costs more than the rest of the country. Part of that has to do with these low carbon fuel standards, where the gasoline has to be actually a little bit different, cleaner. And so similar to the cap and trade program, this is a market-based program that has credits. And for any programs that are promoting cleaner fuels, you get money. And then for traditional gas programs or fossil fuel programs, you basically have to make it cleaner or pay money. And so this is a market mechanism to clean your fuels. The money that goes to electric vehicles are usually going to electric utilities. And so electric utilities claim these credits, but they have to spend the money on these kind of criteria. So it has to benefit current or future EV customers. It has to either educate the public on the benefits of EV transportation. It has to provide rate options that encourage off-peak charging and minimize adverse impacts to the electric grid. And then investor-owned utilities, they have to use, so investor-owned utilities, that is a utility where essentially you have shareholders that you report to. So this would be PG&E, Southern California Edison in LA, and San Diego Gas and Electric. Those are the 3 IOUs, or investor-owned utilities in California. They specifically have to help reduce the purchase price of electric vehicles, or apply an annual credit against customers' bills. They chose not to do this for obvious reasons, or to pay for charging infrastructure. So, depending on the utility that you're with, you can, so for example, PG&E, they'll pay for $500 for you to install a charger at home, similar to Southern California Edison, or you can get money back for like buying an electric vehicle as well. So there are these incentives that operate through this LCFS programs that utilities implement that help to pay for chargers that you might buy at home. Okay? So lots of opportunity to save money, not both on the car, but also on the charger that you may need to couple with the vehicle. All right. Okay, any questions on the charging incentives before we move on to talking about how effective incentives are? Okay, so then, analyzing efficacy of incentives. So why do we even care about this? One, we want to know if these are actually doing anything, right? So the incentives, where is that money kind of coming from? You know, if it's like a tax credit, that just means that the IRS is collecting less taxes, right? And so you can think of this as essentially it's like a taxpayer-funded program. And so if the incentives aren't really doing anything, we don't want to be wasting taxpayer money, right? So understanding how important the incentives are helps to inform relevant policymakers on whether or not we should even have them. And we want to make sure that you get the most bang for your buck, right? This is the classic problem that I've been alluding to with free riders, right? So if I offer $5,000 to buy this EV, how many people are going to buy the EV anyways, regardless of whether or not I offered it, right? And so if 10% of the people, if 10% of the EV car buyers switched a decision and 90% of the people didn't, that means 90% of the people claiming the incentives are freeloaders, right? Versus if it's like half and half, right? And that really changes how efficient the policy is going to be. There's only so much you can do in terms of, I guess, getting rid of freeloaders, right? That's not really possible that you could have eligibility or criteria strict enough that could separate that out. But we do want to know what that number kind of looks like. And then the other thing that I've been alluding to, right, is incentives don't always come right away. So CVRP, we've seen that can take longer if there's funding gaps. Federal tax credit, you have to wait until you file your taxes. So there are some studies that show that the timing of the incentives can have a really big difference. And in fact, there's a pretty well-known paper where they showed that $1 at point of sale can be as effective as a $2 tax credit, which means you're literally twice as effective on a dollar per dollar basis at getting people to buy EVs if you offer it at the point in time in which they buy it compared to if you give it later. Okay. So some of my colleagues, they do these big surveys every year. One of the things they ask is, so this survey goes out specifically to EV owners, and they ask the EV owners, okay, if I had taken away the incentive, like the state rebate or the federal tax credit, would you still have bought the vehicle? And so we can see, the way that people respond. I guess they changed the way the responses are in this one, but yeah, some of them in some versions of it they actually say. Oh, actually, I have it over here. Yeah, here we go. So this slide is a similar type of thing. If I got rid of the federal tax credit, would you still have bought the car? And so the people here in dark blue say, no, I would have bought a regular gas car. These people say, no, I would have bought a hybrid. These in this other blue, they would say, no, I would have bought a different electric car. These in green say, no, I wouldn't have bought any car if there wasn't any incentive. Green is other, we don't really know. That could cover other things. And then the red are people who say, no, I still would have bought the car, right? So in these surveys, we can see about half the people are essentially what we're calling the freeloaders, and then the other half would have actually changed their mind on what car they bought. And that can change if we're asking people who own Teslas, right? There are more quote unquote freeloaders compared to people buying like Nissans or Chevys. Okay. This is just one study that has looked at this. There's some critiques about studies based on surveys because the actual decision that they make changes depending on if you're asked that question, right? That was the whole stated versus revealed preference that we had talked about many lectures ago. So there are other studies, including some that I've done. That look at data based on actual sales, and in those cases, it depends on the kind of study, but the range is generally between like 50 to 70% freeloaders, and I think that in terms of program design is generally kind of acceptable. 70% might be a little bit high, but again, it's not like you can really get rid of these people. You're thinking about all that investment that's going into the program. It's changing the minds of all of, these people on the left. Okay. So this is coming from a study that looked at the timing of when you receive the incentive. And so they look at a value compared to $7,500. So value of incentive relative to an immediate rebate from the government. So if you get the rebates at the point of sale, it's basically the same. If you're getting it 2 weeks later, it reduces in amount. If you get it 6 weeks later, that might be worth a couple $100s. If you wait for the tax credit, right? So this is like if I have to wait to file my taxes, then the value of the 7,500 actually decreases by $1,000 to $1,500. And then as a tax deduction, right, this could be almost $3,000 less in value. So the time of sale, 6 weeks, versus waiting till your tax filing, that can actually change the value tremendously. And so that's why over time, as evidence of this has come out, the structure of these programs has changed, right? So we've seen in California changing from this rebate that you have to apply to eventually to trying to do it at the point of sale. We've seen at the federal level, they introduced this credit transfer to the dealership, again, as a way to essentially move from here to here. And so you're getting, again, more bang for your buck, essentially. Any questions about that? All right. The other thing that I mentioned was that, in principle, we want these incentives to help support these new technologies until they become mature. When they become mature, maybe we don't want to offer everyone these incentives, right? And so you think about eventually, let's say in an ideal world, everyone buys an electric car. Are you still going to be giving these incentives basically to everyone? Probably not. And so when is the appropriate time to phase out incentives? It's not a straightforward decision. We have to think carefully about when we think the market is like self-sustaining. We have actually seen some studies show that the value of the incentives is actually increasing over time. And so this is a particular study that had looked at that, where the change in the purchase decision that I was talking about with this plot, right? So, whether people are in the red versus others, the people who would have made no change in decision is like slowly going down, and then where it makes a bigger difference is actually starting to go up over time. And so that does play into it partly. EVs are hitting kind of a more mainstream market, but because they're more expensive, there's more people interested in the technology, but also need help to buy them. And so we're probably, at the time that this study had come out, probably weren't at the right period to think about getting rid of the incentives. Another way to understand what kind of difference it makes is to look at things that change over time. So think back to the beginning of today when I'm talking about the federal incentives, right? We had the structure where it phased out over time, right? Tesla hit 200,000 vehicles sold, which means the credit goes away. And so what happened to sales after the Tesla credit phase out? It jumped up quite a bit, right? And so 2018, it went out, and then Tesla sales increased. And so all of these people here were buying Teslas, without the credit. And so in this particular case, maybe that's a good thing. You don't have to worry about that freeloader problem, which definitely would have been apparent with Teslas. Yeah, so even though the sales weren't adopted, there is some nuance to think about, right? Because with the adopters, the survey and the model some of the models that estimate these things, they're all about individual decisions. If your market is constrained by supply, buyers who wouldn't buy EVs without the tax credit would be kind of displaced by people who the model thinks would buy them, right? And so essentially what you're doing is you're displacing demand from lower income to higher income. And so you can see evidence of this over time. Household income compared to purchase price, purchase year, and MSRP. Household income, as the purchase price goes up, there's a correlation to household income, and then over time that has gone up as well. Other examples of incentive removal. So Netherlands got rid of incentives for plug-in hybrids, and they subsequently dropped in sales. Denmark removed incentives for 2 years, and in those times, the sales plummeted again before going back up after they instituted incentives again. There's a prominent example of this in Georgia. very early on in like 2014, 2015, they got rid of incentives for electric vehicles that they had at the state level, and that basically caused market share, mainly from Nissan Leafs, to drop down to almost nothing. Okay, so if we get rid of the incentives at the wrong time, you can collapse the market. And yeah, maybe we saw a little bit evidence of that happening, yeah, just last year when the federal tax credit went away. Sales are increasing though, and so do we still need to care? Right, incentives are a tool to facilitate adoption by people. Without incentives, and progress towards mainstream buyers. And so it's this careful balance of thinking about offering incentives to grow and build the market and only removing it once that it's really kind of self-sustaining and the technology is ready. We need, if we believe that EVs are the correct climate solution, this is a technology that we need to address those issues. And so continuing market growth means that this segment of the population that benefits most from incentives, right, the middle and lower income, we need them to continue receiving them up until the market becomes stable. So, do incentives lead to more EVs being sold? Yeah, so it depends on whether the market is constrained by supply and demand, and it's going to depend on whether you care who the EVs are actually sold to, right? So there is a fair bit of nuance in the design of the incentive markets. Okay, so again, to wrap up, what did we learn? Incentives are better applied at the point of purchase, a lot more effective if you don't have to wait for the money. There is the impact of the discounting, and so waiting for it makes it less valuable, and there's uncertainty if you'll actually get it and when. The longer period ones tend to be correlated to more confusing processes to get them. And then it can also change the terms of the financing deals if you're able to get them kind of on the hood. Not everyone needs an incentive, right? So this is our free rider problem again. And doing these cutoffs, with income and with the price of the vehicles, these are design mechanisms that are intended to reduce the free rider problem. And in other words, trying to better target the incentives to people who need them and to the right cars. Incentives might increase in importance over time, but an incentive that's offered in 2011 versus 2026 is very different. If I'm giving, $1,000 a car in 2026 and $10,000 a car in 2011, the cost of the program in 2026 is still going to be a lot larger because I'm selling a lot more than 10 times as many EVs back then, right? And so think about the scaling of your program and what that means in terms of how much you have to spend to pay out those incentives. And lastly, when will incentives not be needed? For some people, that's now, right? So there's some people who can afford these vehicles. But if we're thinking about everyone as a whole and how important the technology is to, mitigate like climate issues and pollution and that sort of thing, a lot of folks still think that the policy needs to still be in place so that we can, continue pushing the market forward. So when EVs are a whole product without these like early market issues, then maybe we can start to think about getting rid of some of those subsidies. Okay, and so that's it for today. we can now do our quiz. And some people are coming in a little bit later, and so I'm just going to go back to our some notes for next week. Again, Monday's lecture, I won't be here, but I'll have a colleague subbing in to help review content and talk about future of EVs, and we'll have the last quiz. Wednesday's lecture is optional. We'll have an EV showcase at our EV Research Center. And you get extra credit worth 1 quiz if you show up. The showcase won't be for the full time. You can show up and they'll probably end 30, 40 minutes.
Yeah, the final design of it. The cost estimation is a part of it. Yeah, I feel like I'm going too much in detail.